Just to connect this, please. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. If I understand the session correctly and the topic as my friend Athar in particular tried to explain, Ihsan and I don't know if we are going to disagree or not, but we're supposed to try to argue for positions of separation or reconciliation of science and religion in general and science and Islam in particular. And I'm the defender of the reconciliation thesis. And I think it's going to be interesting, and I think it makes sense to start with this. What kind of paradigm, what kind of relationship should there be between Islam and science so that we know how to handle this big topic in its various ramifications before we start looking at specifics and before we start looking at applications and implementation, etc. We need to put a general philosophy in place. And so what I'm going to do, if I can get the IT person to connect my laptop. Yeah, I need this connected, please. So what I'm going to try to do is two things. One is put this separation reconciliation idea in context, because separation of science and religion or science and Islam, reconciliation are not the only two proposals on the table that have been put forward by various thinkers. So we need to step back a little bit and say, okay, what have people suggested and what are the different proposals and what are the different schools of thought? And then I can focus on reconciliation, or what my preferred term, harmonization. And that I hope will be rather brief. No, I just need the connection to the projector. Okay. I don't need the internet. But more importantly, I will try to spend the larger portion of my time on how this relates to education, because I think most of us in the room are related to education one way or another. We're professors or educators. There's a number of students, which pleases me a lot. No, there's HDMI. Okay, can we connect it through a USB? Okay. And so one of the main arguments and one of the main topics at hand is how do we handle the relationship between science and Islam or science and religion in the educational context? What happens? So do we separate science classes completely from religious questions, religious topics, etc.? And one of my main arguments for reconciliation and for the need for harmonization is it is extremely difficult, and I'll try to argue for this and show you a number of ideas. It is extremely difficult to implement this non-overlapping magisteria thesis, this complete separation of the two. And so that will be my, thank you very much. Okay. So as I said, the first idea is, first of all, why is there an issue at hand to begin with? We heard quite a bit this morning about the golden age and about this harmony that existed, this huge advancement in the sciences and in all areas of thought and culture in the Islamic civilization. And people quite often ask, they say, why is there an issue? Why are you guys writing articles and books and organizing seminars like this? Islam and science have always lived in harmony. Islam has always encouraged science, as can be demonstrated through the 1,000-year glorious epoch of the Islamic civilization, with many, many advances in different fields. So why do you think that there is even a discussion today as to whether there should be any separation or reconciliation or integration or dialogue or independence or the different paradigms that are proposed? And my usual response is because we're dealing with modern science. And as Professor Badran said during his presentation, the session today, the first session is indeed entitled Islam and Modern Science. And modern science has brought in a new philosophy of science. I was just talking to one of the students earlier outside, and the interest in philosophy of science pleases me very much, especially when I come here in Jordan. And so the issue is really the nature of modern science. In which way is modern science different from the old science or from the old way of doing science? I could speak at length about how al-Biruni did his science, how Ibn Sina did his science, how Ibn al-Haytham did his science, etc. And we can try to extract, okay, so what are the different modes of thinking and what the different methodologies? Succinctly, because time is very limited, there are two issues. There are two, what I consider to be pillars of modern science. One is methodological naturalism, and this is controversial, there is no doubt. People dispute this or disagree with this. Some people, I'm sure we will hear this during the day. But I believe that this is integral to the way modern science is done today. And I, in fact, say, I don't know anybody, a believer or non-believer, any scientist in the world, Muslim or non-Muslim, who consciously or unconsciously does not abide by methodological naturalism, meaning that they only propose natural explanations to any phenomena of nature that they are investigating. You cannot invoke supernatural or supranatural agents when you're dealing with natural phenomena. You cannot try to explain a disease nowadays by invoking demons or angels or devils or spirits of any kind. You cannot explain a physical phenomenon by saying the angels helped this occur or even God intervened. In science, in modern science today, this is a no-no. Now, whether this implies that God is there or not there, active or not active, acting or not acting, is a whole different issue and a long separate discussion. But when we are doing science, everybody is doing natural science. And that is very, very crucial to understanding why is modern science now challenging and there's some friction with the believers. Secondly, there is the idea of falsifiability. If you cannot predict for me some possible tests, some possible implications of your hypothesis, even before it becomes a theory, then your hypothesis is not even scientific. And that is a new and important way of distinguishing science from non-science. This is the so-called demarcation problem. In addition to this, to these core philosophy of science issues that modern science has brought in, there are a number of theories and results that are also challenging to the believers, Muslims or Christian or other. And those include evolution, which we'll hear about later today. These include some aspects of cosmology, which we'll hear about later today. And so it is not always easy to just say, oh, I'm doing science and I leave aside my beliefs. Because what you do in science and what you learn from science is directly or indirectly going to challenge what you have learned or what you have believed. So this is my first issue. Now, there have been a number of reactions by Muslim thinkers. Some of them we heard this morning from Dr. Munif Zubi during the 70s and 80s. Unfortunately, in the 90s and early 2000s, the debates and the strength of the discussions subsided quite a bit. But in the 70s and 80s, we had a number of very, very important scholars and thinkers and philosophers, Muslims, who proposed all kinds of ideas. For example, and I'm just going to run over them very briefly. I have slides on each one of them if you want to discuss later. But one of them is Sayyid Hussein Nasr, who was mentioned a couple of times this morning, who I put in the category of the conflict thesis. Essentially, he says modern science cannot be reconciled with Islam, essentially, in the core of it. He says, unless you transform modern science, unless you insist on injecting into modern science spirits and spirituality, your modern science is going to be broken and is not going to be compatible with Islam. So it's a conflict thesis, and it's a radical proposition that modern science has to be modified and transformed and cannot be accepted as such. Then others, Ziauddin Sardar, ethical, also called Islamic science, that science has to be modified to some extent, not as radical as Sayyid Hussein Nasr, but to some extent because there are some philosophical or metaphysical issues within the fabric of modern science, and particularly in the implementation and application of modern science, the ethical dimension in particular. Abdus Salam, who we also heard about this morning a couple of times, was on the other side of the spectrum, insisting that science is universal. Science cannot be Islamic or non-Islamic or Jewish or Hindu or Christian or whatever. Science is science, and then whatever you understand from science, how you apply it, how you implement it, that depends on your culture and your beliefs, but science in itself is objective and is universal, and that is a big, strong claim. Then we also heard about the Islamization of science, which 95% of it has evaporated, but still exists in at least some corners of the Islamic world. And then there is this whole phenomenon, social phenomenon of i'jaz, scientific i'jaz, the i'jaz al-ilmi, which is unbelievably popular. And I, again, have all kinds of views and examples on this if you want to discuss this later. And then there are, more recently in the last 10, 15 years, some new voices, what Stefano Biliardi calls the new generation of Islam and science, which includes some people who are here in the audience, including the Professor Al-Ta'i, Dr. Golshani, Professor Mehdi Golshani, who was mentioned this morning, and some others who have tried to sort of advance some new ideas, including, for example, this theistic science that Mehdi Golshani has publicized, including my, as Professor Badran has mentioned, my push for adopting the Ibn Rushd Averroesian paradigm. I'll skip over this, I'm sorry, because this was the USB version of my talk, so I have to skip all of this and get to this. Now, I want to spend the next 10 minutes or so telling you why I think this is relevant and, in fact, crucial in the education realm. Let me just read for you a few ideas. When I teach astronomy, and I'm an astronomy and physics professor, more specifically the evolution of Earth. So we go through the evolution of the solar system, the appearance of the planets, the evolution of the Earth, early atmosphere, hydrogen, etc. And then there's geological activity, atmosphere is full of CO2, and then because the Earth happened to be in the right place, then there is the appearance of liquid water, and then with liquid water and the other right conditions, life emerges, and as life emerges, it starts to release oxygen, and then life develops, etc. So I'm explaining all of this astronomically, physically, chemically, environmentally, etc. And at some point, I often get the following questions. Sir, are you adopting an evolutionary, meaning Darwinian paradigm? Because you're saying Earth evolved, and there's water, there's life, there's an impact on the atmosphere, and then there's oxygen, so life evolves some more, and then we have animals, etc. And people start to see where I'm going with this, and they start fidgeting. The students start to fidget. Sir, did God play any role in this, or was he confined to the creation of the universe? So those are the kinds of questions I get. Sir, could life appear without God's intervention? You just said life appeared in the waters. So you're saying that life could have appeared without God acting, intervening? Sir, how does that compare or relate to Quranic verses that describe these phenomena, meaning the atmosphere, the earth, the geology, the waters, mountains, atmosphere, etc.? Sir, what do you say about the many claims that a lot of what science has discovered can be found in the Quran? So these are the questions I get in my astronomy class. And I often write, God help the people who teach biology. Yeah, if I get all these questions in astronomy, and I don't want to teach biology. By the way, my two sons are both biology students, but okay. So I get the other questions, I get them at home. Huh? And Professor Badran, okay. The effect of students' religious, cultural mindsets, their worldviews, on their interaction with science topics is strong and clear in the Muslim world, but it can also be seen elsewhere. The science education community has come to realize the importance of this issue. This is very important, a new development in the last 10 years or so, if you read science education journals, you find that this issue of religion has become crucial and important. 10, 15 years ago, people would not even mention religion in science education articles. But now it is there in many, many articles. Because people have realized that student learning does not occur in a vacuum or on a blank state. Students come with their preconceptions, with their background learning. A number of studies have shown this belief factor to be one of the most essential ones in science education. Lynn Honey in 2015, this is just last year, wrote an article titled "Why I Teach the Controversy Using Creationism to Teach Critical Thinking." She's a psychology professor, and she uses this debate between evolution and creationism to teach critical thinking. And people said, what are you doing? We told you we cannot mix these things. And she said, because I want to ask whether ignoring supernatural views in the minds of the students has allowed those views to remain as viable alternatives to scientific hypotheses in the minds of students. Essentially what she's saying is, if we ignore these topics, if we do not address them in the minds of the students, we are letting the students develop alternative ideas. She considers her pedagogy approach as consistent with the teaching as persuasion model, where different views are discussed and some are then rejected on the basis of demerit. She also likens her approach to a vaccination against pseudo-scientific arguments. So now people are beginning to contend with these religious views. I want to give you an example of a survey that I conducted at my university among my students in March, April 2010. This is about six years ago. 105 students, 73 female, 32 male, non-science major students taking my astronomy and physics classes. 89% of them Muslim, and so I asked them some of the following questions. And I'm just going to highlight some that are relevant to our discussion today. So I made these statements and I asked them to tell me whether they agree, strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree. I think there are conflicts between what my religion teaches me and what science claims. And as you can see, about 75% of them say, no, there are no conflicts. 25% of them say there is some conflict between what I have learned in my religious upbringing and what science is teaching me. Then I try to reconcile the facts of science with the truth of my religion, and 32% say, no, I do not. So there's an issue there. So they think that there is no conflict, or there is a conflict, but they don't try to reconcile. They try to reconcile, which means there is some confusion as to how this should be approached. I think it is best not to mix. So I just want to probe some more, just want to make sure what they are thinking. So I say, I think it is best not to mix ideas from science and ideas from religion. And guess what? 73% say, no, I don't agree with that. You should not be not mixing. So they don't try to reconcile, but they don't want them to be separated. I think it's just typical of, and I have been teaching at universities for 25 years, I think it is typical of the kind of confused methodologies that we find in the minds of the students. I'll just continue with some quick examples. I think religious ideas or viewpoints, for example, on the creation of the world, biological evolution, etc., should be discussed by science professors. Pay attention to this statement. So, should we be bringing up these religious ideas in science classes, is what I'm asking my students. And 66% of them say yes. These ideas should be addressed by science professors. You should not just say, according to the students, well, that's not my issue, your whatever religious ideas, just take them to the imam or something. Actually, just to put a parenthesis, I remember following up that example of what happens to the earth and it evolves, etc. And students started to ask me, so are you adopting an evolutionary paradigm? And so my sort of challenging reply was, is there any other? Meaning, of course. And so one student was a bit perplexed. This is just the quick anecdote. And so a few days later came back to me and said, sir, after what you mentioned the other day in the discussion, I went to the imam and I asked him about the evolution. I swear, I asked him about the theory of evolution. I said, you went to whom? He said, I went to the imam. And I said, why? He said, because I wanted to know if it's compatible with Islam. I said, does your imam really understand the theory of evolution? And that's what you need to be careful about. And that will be, as you will see in a minute, that will be one of the issues that we will be facing. Anyway, so let me skip over this. There is another interesting study that came out a few years ago from Egypt. Nasser Mansour, whom I haven't met, did a PhD in Britain on science education. And he was more interested in what is the religious background of students and teachers. And so he focused on Egypt. He's Egyptian, doing a PhD on science education in Britain. So he published a couple of papers a few years ago, surveyed Egyptian science teachers. He found that less than 20% of them see independence or conflict between Islam and science. 61% of them see integration. Those of you who know the typology, this is Ian Barber's typology of going from, there can be 4 possible ways of relating science and religion according to Ian Barber, going from independence, dialogue, independence, conflict, integration, dialogue, these 4. So the Egyptian science teachers believe, in large majority, 61% of them, that there should be integration of the 2, which is, by the way, very different from what I called harmonization earlier. But anyway, so he asked them further. So he says, who should undertake that kind of harmonization? 53% of them say it should be the science teachers. 20% of them say it should be the religion teachers. And 27% of them say both together. 60% of them report no confidence in addressing science-religion topics. So they're saying, most of them are saying it should be the science teachers who should do it, but most of them are saying, but I am not able to do it. I'm not competent to do that, to relate the 2 properly. More alarmingly, that's why I put that in red at the bottom, 40% of them report a negative attitude toward what they call non-Muslim sciences. I don't know, I think they see science as we do it today as Western science and consider it as non-Muslim science, and they say, I don't quite subscribe to that. 40% of them, science teachers. So I'll conclude. Science and religion constitute 2 important ways to look at the world. And we heard this from Her Royal Highness this morning. We heard it from Dr. Munif. Science describes how the physical world works. Religion presents a philosophy of life and existence, its meaning and purpose. So on the face of it, these 2 things are separate. One deals with the physics, if you like. One deals with the meaning, the metaphysics, if you like. But there are clearly some points of interaction, of interface. The problem is how to navigate the straits where the 2 come in contact, such as origin issues. Origin of life, origin of humans, origin of the world, future of life, future of humans, future of the world, etc. And how to construct a coherent overall picture. There are obvious issues of interaction/friction for teachers and students on science and Islam, particularly when students bring in erroneous beliefs. It is not pedagogically constructive to shut out students' attempts to reconcile the science they learn with the religious education they receive. I don't think this is pedagogically constructive. Unfortunately, science teachers do not always fully, clearly understand the nature of science itself. Science teachers do not always understand science in its nature and philosophy, and how it distinguishes itself from religion without necessarily opposing it. So just saying, okay, we need to distinguish the 2 methodologies does not mean we are putting them in conflict or in opposition. And there's some training there that's needed. Likewise, and even more so, religion teachers do not always clearly differentiate the natures and methodologies of religion and of science. And in the end, it's a matter of methodology. And that's the bottom problem. It is therefore not easy to undertake the harmonization, reconciliation, and not slip conceptually, methodologically, etc. So I'm not saying it's easy to do this. I'm saying we need to address it. We need to do something about it. Otherwise, the science teachers are confused, the students are confused, and we are leaving, this crisis, this malaise over there, and not doing anything about it. But I am fully aware that it is very difficult, very difficult. Anyway, I want to thank you, and I just leave here some links if you want to pursue this. with us in the future.